I've been asked 3 times now to tell this story, and each time the people asking get a little more official looking, sit a little straighter, put fancier recording equipment on the table between us. First it was the station administrator. Then it was some kind of compact investigator. Now it's whatever you people are, with your matching coats and your careful eyes and your way of not blinking when I talk. So fine. I'll tell it again. But I want to be clear about something before I start, because every time I tell it, the people listening sort of reshape it while I talk. They fill in details I didn't give them, make it bigger than it was, more dramatic, cleaner. And it wasn't clean. None of it was. It was a Wednesday, or whatever Dusk 9 calls a Wednesday, which is the 4th shift cycle of a standard station week. And it smelled like coolant and burnt insulation, and somebody's lunch from the food cart near Bay 11, and I was just trying to do my job. That's the part nobody seems to want to include. That I was just trying to do my job. His name was Deo Akafer. He worked on the same maintenance crew as me, the rotating technical staff that handled engine diagnostics and hull integrity checks on vessels passing through way station Dusk 9. Most people in that job had come from somewhere bigger and ended up here the way things end up in the back of a drawer. Not intentionally, just gradually. Deo had come from Earth. He talked about Lagos sometimes, late in a shift, when the bays were quiet and we were eating whatever somebody had scrounged from the commissary cart. He talked about the smell of rain on hot pavement and his mother's cooking, and a particular mango tree in a yard he'd grown up in that he said he'd probably never see again. He was 34 years old. He had a gap between his 2 front teeth. He wore the same worn-out pair of engineering boots every single day because he'd broken them imperfectly and wasn't willing to start over with a new pair. He was, without any exaggeration, the most ordinary person I have ever known, and I mean that in the best possible way, because ordinary people, real ordinary people, are the ones who surprise you. What I'm about to tell you surprised everybody, including, I suspect, Deo himself. Way Station Dusk 9 had been operational for 31 years at the time of the incident. It occupied a fixed position at the junction of 3 mid-corridor trade lanes, which made it commercially important but administratively unremarkable. The kind of place that processed vessels, collected docking fees, and ensured minimal regulatory compliance without drawing significant attention from any direction. The station's population on the day in question was approximately 4,300 residents and transient personnel. Of those, roughly 2,000 were permanent station staff, administrators, technical crews, medical personnel, security, catering. The remaining population consisted of passing travelers, traders, transport crew awaiting turnaround, and a rotating detachment of 12 compact peacekeeping personnel assigned to maintain order and inspect cargo manifests. The station commander at that time was Administrator Breck Tolan, a Vethian national in his mid-50s who was, by all accounts, a competent and unremarkable bureaucrat who had managed Dusk 9 without significant incident for 9 consecutive years. He would later describe the day of the incident as beginning completely normally. His exact words in debrief were, "It was boring. We were all very comfortable. That was the last comfortable day for a long time." At 3:40 hours station time, a vessel entered the docking queue from the outer approach lane. The vessel's registration filed with the approach control tower identified it as the Harrow Wind, a Class 7 courier transport registered to a private logistics firm based in the Murrin Trade Cluster. The filing was routine. The vessel's mass signature matched its stated cargo manifest. Its docking request was processed automatically, assigned to Bay 14, one of the mid-level bays typically reserved for smaller commercial traffic, and cleared for final approach. What the automatic systems did not flag, because they were not calibrated to look for it, was the irregularity in the vessel's heat signature in the forward crew compartment. It would be an hour before anyone noticed. By then, Deo Akafer was already in Bay 14. I fixed the pressure coupling on Bay 9's umbilical arm today. Took me 4 hours because whoever installed it the first time had clearly never been told about thermal expansion. They seated it dry, and then the whole housing cracked when the first freighter came in with a hot engine. Basic stuff. You'd think basic stuff would be handled correctly on a station that's been running for 30 years, but here we are. Marin thinks I'm too hard on the previous technicians. She's probably right. She usually is. I just hate seeing sloppy work on systems that people's lives depend on even indirectly. A cracked pressure coupling isn't going to kill anyone today, but it's going to fail at exactly the wrong moment someday, and then it will. Anyway, 4 hours. The replacement housing took 3 hours to arrive because the parts requisition system flagged it as non-urgent, which is technically true, but only if you don't think about it very hard. I put it in the work notes. Nobody will read the work notes. There's a new vessel scheduled for Bay 14 tomorrow or the next day. A courier by the registration. I'm on pre-arrival inspection for that bay. Should be straightforward. Those Class 7s are usually well maintained because they're expensive to run and the companies that operate them can't afford breakdowns. I'll check the docking clamp alignment and the fuel port connections and probably be done in 90 minutes. Then I'm going to eat something that isn't from the commissary cart, and I'm going to sit in my quarters and watch whatever's on the broadcast relay, and I'm going to try very hard not to think about anything complicated. I'm tired, not bad tired, just ordinary tired, the kind that comes from doing a real thing for a whole day. That's fine, that's actually fine. Section IV, testimony continued. Witness Marin Solis. Deo was already in Bay 14 when the Hera Wind docked. That was standard procedure. The pre-arrival tech goes in early, runs the equipment checks, makes sure the docking apparatus is calibrated for the incoming vessel's mass and dimensions. By the time the ship actually settled into the clamps, Deo had been working in that bay for over an hour. I was in Bay 11, 2 bays over, doing a coolant system flush on a long-haul cargo carrier that had come in the previous shift. I could hear things through the walls. Stations have good structural sound transmission if you know how to listen, but mostly I was paying attention to my own work. The Hera Wind docked at 4:07. I know because I checked my chron when I heard the clamps engage. We all sort of count them automatically, the sounds of docking. It becomes background noise, but you still register it. A vessel settling into a bay has a particular sequence of sounds. The outer approach doors cycling, the guiding arms extending, the magnetic clamps engaging in sequence, the final pressure seal. You hear it dozens of times a day. It becomes like breathing. At 4:12, I heard something that wasn't part of that sequence. It was a sound I can only describe as impact followed by silence followed by a second impact. Like something falling, stopping, falling again. From the direction of Bay 14. I didn't think much of it. Things fall in bays all the time. Equipment gets knocked over, personnel trip on the umbilical connections, cargo shifts during decompression. I noted it and kept working. At 4:19 I heard Deo's voice. Not words, just his voice, that specific register he used when something had surprised him, higher than his normal talking voice. Rapid. I put down my tools. I was the security officer assigned to Bay 14 that morning. My responsibilities were standard. Verify docking credentials on arrival, scan incoming personnel for prohibited materials, log any cargo offloading, and maintain a visual watch on the bay perimeter. The Hera Wind came in clean on all automated scans. The credentials matched. The heat signature from the cargo hold was consistent with the manifest temperature-sensitive medical supplies, which explained the regulated atmosphere readings. Nothing flagged. The vessel's outer hatch opened at 4:10 hours, standard procedure following pressurization. I was at my post approximately 20 meters from the hatch, at the bay's secondary access console. No one came out. That was the first anomaly. Vessels that dock at a way station, especially courier ships on timed routes, don't sit quiet after docking. You get crew, you get cargo handlers, you get someone coming out to file the in-person docking declaration. Automated systems handle most of it now, but there's still a required in-person check-in within 10 minutes of hatch opening for commercial traffic. That's compact regulation. At 4:14, 4 minutes after the hatch opened, I triggered a communication to the vessel's internal channel to request in-person check-in. No response. I logged it and started moving toward the hatch. Protocol says to approach and knock. That sounds ridiculous for a space station, I know. But the physical protocol exists because sometimes crews are asleep or incapacitated from long-haul transit, and the comms don't penetrate the hull effectively on older vessels. I was about 12 meters from the hatch when it happened. Something came through the hatch opening, not walking, not stepping. Falling. A figure I couldn't immediately determine species, because of the suit they were wearing, which was unlike any I recognized from standard compact documentation. Full body, articulated, a dark material that seemed to absorb the bay lighting rather than reflect it, with integrated helmet optics that had gone dark. The power indicators on the suit were all offline. The figure came through the hatch at an angle, like they'd been leaning against the interior wall, and simply lost the ability to hold themselves upright. They hit the deck hard. I was drawing my scanning equipment and reaching for my communication unit simultaneously, which is to say I was reacting but not yet thinking clearly. Before I could get either device properly in hand, Deo Akafer, who had been on the far side of the bay, near the fuel umbilical connections, crossed the bay at a pace that I can only describe as a run. I did not know the man well. He was maintenance. He was quiet. He did his job. I had never seen him move like that. He was at the figure's side in seconds. They keep asking me what I was thinking. I've tried to explain that I wasn't thinking much, or not in the way people seem to expect, like I had some plan or some assessment of the situation. I heard the sound. I turned and saw someone fall. My body moved before my brain caught up. That's just what happens when someone falls and they're clearly hurt. At least that's what happens for me. I don't know what I expected to do. I just went. She was face down when I got there. The suit she was wearing, I'd never seen anything like it. Not even in the equipment catalogs, and I've read a lot of those. It's one of those habits you pick up after years in technical work. The material was different. Not different like new model different, but different like someone had approached the problem of what armor should do from a completely separate theoretical foundation. It moved differently under my hands when I reached to check for breathing through the suit's ventilation system. The helmet's external readout, a small panel on the side of the jaw assembly, was offline. All of it. No power indicators, no vitals display, no status lights. In my experience, that kind of total system failure in an integrated suit usually means one of two things: catastrophic power cell rupture, which would have caused obvious visible damage and probably a localized electrical discharge, or external interference that had overridden and shut down the suit's systems remotely. There was no visible damage. I registered that fact without fully understanding what it meant. I didn't have time to understand what it meant. I found the manual emergency release on the helmet's neck seal. Almost every enclosed suit design has one. They're usually in the same anatomical position regardless of manufacture, because you need to find them under stress, and I broke the seal. The helmet came off. I need to stop here for a moment because I want to say something about the person I saw, and I want to say it carefully, because I know how what comes after in this story sounds, and I don't want the beginning to be lost in it. She looked like she was dying. I don't mean she looked sick. I mean she looked like someone who had been fighting very hard against something very bad for a very long time, and had finally stopped being able to fight, and her body was only now catching up to what her will had been refusing to accept. There was a quality to her stillness that I recognized. I had seen it once before, years ago, when a crane collapsed on a construction site in Lagos, and a worker had been pulled out from under the debris still breathing, but barely. That quality, like the space between one breath and the next, had become uncertain. She was, I'm going to say what she looked like, and I'm going to try to be accurate rather than poetic about it. She was humanoid. Close enough to human in facial structure that my brain processed her as a person immediately and completely, without hesitation or categorization. High cheekbones, darker complexion than I've been able to assign to any specific reference. Eyes, when they opened briefly as I removed the helmet, that were a color I don't have a word for, not in English, not in any language I've encountered since. Something between amber and silver, and something that wasn't either. Long hair, darker than the suit, that had been pulled back tightly under the helmet and came loose in sections as the seal broke. She was badly hurt. I could see that the suit had been doing a lot of work to compensate for injuries it could no longer compensate for, because once the helmet was off, the extent of it became clear. There was a wound at her side. I could see where the suit material had attempted to seal around it, which told me the suit had active medical functions, and that those functions were failing along with everything else. The wound itself was. Look, I know basic emergency medicine. Everyone in technical work on a station does the certification. But this went beyond what certification prepares you for. The wound was deep, and it was doing things that wounds don't usually do, which is the only way I can describe it without having the vocabulary for what was actually happening biologically. I did what I knew how to do. I called for medical. And while I waited, I held her head up so she wouldn't aspirate. That's what you do. That's the basic thing. Make sure the airway is clear. And I talked to her. Not because I thought she could hear me necessarily. Just because silence in that situation felt wrong, felt like giving up. I told her she was going to be okay. I told her we had medical coming. I told her she was safe. I don't know if any of those things were true at the time. I said them anyway. I received the medical alert from Bay 14 at 4:21 hours. The automated triage signal was coded for trauma, blunt force, and possible internal, with an additional flag for unknown species requiring specialist consultation. That last flag concerned me more than the trauma itself, not because I'm uncomfortable with non-human patients, but because the specialist consultation flag only triggers automatically if the medical scanner can't match the patient's biological profile to anything in its database. Dusk 9's medical scanner has a comprehensive database. It covers every species registered with the compact and a significant number of unregistered ones. When it can't find a match, it usually means you're dealing with someone completely outside the compact's documentation. My emergency team reached Bay 14 in 6 minutes. Standard response time. I wish it had been faster. The scene when we arrived. Security officer Vri standing at a distance, hand on his sidearm but not drawn, expression of someone waiting to be told what to do. The maintenance engineer, Akafer, on the deck next to the patient. No equipment, no protective gear, no protocol being observed at all, just kneeling there with the patient's head resting on his knee and talking in a low, even voice. The patient was alive, barely, by the readings I got on first approach. What the readings also told me, and I've thought about this moment a great deal in the weeks since, was that the patient's biology was doing something that medicine doesn't usually do. It was compensating. Actively, aggressively compensating, in ways that my instruments could register but not fully account for. Like watching a system repair itself in real time, but slowly, because something had compromised its ability to do so at full speed. I've practiced medicine for 22 years. I have never seen anything like what the patient's physiology was doing in those scans. I've also never had a patient who, upon opening her eyes and seeing the person beside her, said something in a language that my universal translator couldn't parse, and had the maintenance engineer respond by saying quietly, I know, you're safe. I've got you." He didn't understand what she said either. I know that now. He simply responded to the tone of it. I will admit that I paused for a moment before beginning my clinical assessment. Just a moment. Then I did my job. By the time I was briefed on the situation in Bay 14, the patient had been transferred to our medical facility, and my team had begun reviewing the HFY's onboard records. What we found did not simplify my morning. The vessel had, as filed, originated from the Marin trade cluster, but its travel log, once we got past the surface layer, showed a route that was not consistent with commercial courier operations. The ship had passed through 7 relay points in the previous 36 hours, each one using a different transit code, not falsified codes, which would have been detectable, but legitimate codes obtained through multiple channels. Whoever had planned this vessel's route had been thorough. They had not wanted it tracked. The cabin aboard the HFY showed evidence of a fight, not a cargo shift, not an accident. A fight. Equipment had been damaged. 2 of the ship's onboard systems had been deliberately disabled, the emergency beacon and the standard identity transponder. The medical bay showed evidence of use, specifically the emergency treatment station, which had been used to full capacity and had apparently failed partway through its treatment cycle, which would explain why the patient's injuries were in the state they were when she was found. In the forward cabin, we found a second individual, or rather, what remained of one. Species unidentified, the records will say compact type unknown, which is the formal classification when you can't match anyone, with injuries inconsistent with the ship's trajectory or any onboard equipment failure. These were deliberate injuries, and I'll leave it at that. We also found, secured in the ship's hidden compartment, the kind that doesn't show on standard scans, that you only find if you know to look for it, a device I didn't recognize. My team flagged it immediately, and we secured it under lockdown without touching it. The Compact's technical response team would take another 4 days to arrive and tell us it was a long-range signal disruptor of a type not currently in production anywhere in Compact documented space, which meant it came from somewhere we didn't have documentation for. My report to the station administrator at 700 was one of the most uncomfortable conversations of my professional career. Not because Administrator Tolan was upset, he was, but that was manageable, because I didn't have answers to the questions he was asking, and I had a feeling that the answers, when they came, were going to change the comfortable, boring nature of Waystation Dusk 9 significantly and permanently. I was correct. She regained full consciousness at 900 on the second day. I was there. I'd been rotating in and out of the ward since the first day. There was no way to hand this case off. Not when the biology was doing what hers was doing. Not when every 3 or 4 hours something new happened that required documentation and assessment, and a quiet moment alone to collect myself before going back in. Her healing rate was extraordinary. I wrote that in the clinical notes, and I'll say it plainly here, extraordinary. The wound at her side, which had been critical on arrival, was sealed by the end of the first day. Not scarred over, not bandaged, not medicated into stability, sealed, as if the tissue had decided what it needed to do and then done it. My instruments logged it in detail. I have the scans. Anyone who wants to review them is welcome to do so. On the second morning, she opened her eyes. Not like someone waking slowly, like someone returning to a place they had briefly left. She looked at the ceiling of the medical ward for a moment. Then she turned her head and looked at me. Then she looked around the room with a deliberate, methodical attention that I recognized. It's the same thing you do when you're assessing a situation, and you need to understand your environment before you can make any decisions. Then she said something. The translator, which I'd calibrated with recordings from the first day's sporadic vocalizations, rendered it as approximately, "Where is the one who found me?" I told her the maintenance engineer was in the station. She appeared to understand, whether from the translation or from something else I couldn't determine. She asked me his name. I told her. She repeated it once, quietly to herself. Then she asked for water, which I provided, and then she very carefully and methodically sat up, which I had not recommended, and looked at me with those eyes that I still cannot fully describe, and said something that the translator rendered as, "I need time. There is much that must be reconsidered." I told her she needed rest. She looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as genuinely considering my opinion before deciding what to do with it, which is different from most patients' expressions in that circumstance. She rested. Boo! They told me she'd asked for me on the second day, and I didn't know what to do with that. I want to be clear about my state of mind during those 2 days between finding her and when they let me visit. I was working my shift, or trying to. Marin kept looking at me sideways, which is her way of checking on someone, and I kept pretending not to notice. Security had interviewed me twice, standard. I understood that. The station administrator had sent a message that I was to remain on station and available for further questions, which was fine. I wasn't planning to go anywhere. But what I kept thinking about, and I know this is going to sound strange, given everything that came after, what I kept thinking about was the sound of her voice. Not the words, because I hadn't understood them, just the sound, the specific frequency of someone saying something when they're at their absolute limit, when they have used up every resource they had and there's nothing left to spend and they are still trying to communicate, still reaching out. There's something in that lands differently than regular speech. It gets under your skin in a way that's hard to explain. They brought me to the medical ward on the afternoon of the second day. She was sitting up in the ward bed, not lying down, not inclined, sitting, properly, the way you sit when you're conducting something. She had changed out of the hospital garments into something from, I found out later it was from a supply closet, a set of standard station utility clothes that were too large for her, and that she had apparently folded and adjusted with precision. She looked like someone who would not let their circumstances determine how they carried themselves. I was wearing my work clothes, my boots with the scuff on the left toe. I hadn't thought to change. The translator at this point had been calibrated well enough for basic communication, and Dr. Perrin had set one up on a small unit near the bed. We looked at each other for a moment. Then she said, the translator gave me, "You held my head." It wasn't a question. I said yes. She said, "You spoke to me." I said yes. I said I wasn't sure she could hear me, but it seemed wrong not to. She considered that. Then she said, "I could hear you. I understand your language. I have understood it for a long time." I think my expression must have done something because she said, "Yes, I did not tell you then. There were reasons." I asked if she was okay now. She said, "I am considerably better than I was, because of what you did." I told her it wasn't a big deal, which I immediately realized was possibly the wrong thing to say in this context, but which was also simply true to how I felt about it. I did what anyone would do. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't categorize. Then she said, "You did not run." I didn't know what to say to that. I said I don't really run when someone needs help. It's just not the way I'm built. She said, "Many have run from me." And I thought that sounded incredibly lonely and incredibly strange for someone who looked the way she looked and moved the way she moved, which was with this precise, contained authority that didn't seem to leave much room for something like loneliness. But there it was. I sat down in the chair beside the bed, because standing in that conversation felt wrong. We talked for a long time. At 1400 hours, day 4, we received the first communication from a compact military vessel in response to our incident reports. The vessel identified itself as the Ironville, a Class 12 compact enforcement cruiser, and requested immediate secure channel communication with the station administrator and security chief. The nature of that communication is partially redacted in this record at the request of the Compact's liaison office. What I can document is the following. The patient in our medical ward had been identified. The identification process, as briefly explained by the Ironville's commanding officer, had involved cross-referencing biological trace data from our medical scans with records from a compact database that I was informed exists, but to which station-level security personnel do not have access. I will not state in this record what the identification revealed, because I have been asked not to, and because the formal documentation of that information belongs in a classification tier that this report does not reach. What I will say is that when the Ironville's commanding officer, a Veloran female named Sothrek, whose composure was significant and whose voice did not change pitch through the entire communication, finished explaining who our patient was, Administrator Tolan sat quietly for approximately 30 seconds before asking a clarifying question. The clarifying question was, "Are you certain?" Sothrek said, "Completely." Tolan said, "Does she know that we know?" Sothrek said, "She knows everything. She has always known everything. That is rather the nature of her position." Tolan looked at me. I looked at Tolan. We had been running an ordinary way station for a collective 46 years. We were not equipped for this. I filed my daily security log without mentioning the communication. I was told to. I asked what I was to tell my staff. Sothrek said, "Tell them nothing changes. Tell them to treat the patient as a patient. Tell them to be respectful and unhurried." I asked about Deo Akefer. Sothrek paused. In my experience of the conversation, it was the only pause she took. She said, "The engineer, yes, he is a complication." I asked what kind. She said, "The interesting kind." Her name, the name she gave me, which I later found out is not exactly her name but is close enough in phonetic terms that it functioned as a name for our conversations, was something that translates approximately as Sale. She told me to use it. She said it like she was testing something, the syllables, watching my mouth form them. Sale. I said it back. She said yes, that was correct. We've talked every day since that second day. Dr. Perrin lets me come in during the midday break and again after my shift ends. I don't entirely know why she keeps saying yes. Maybe because Sale asked her to, and Perrin is professionally inclined to give recovering patients what they need. Maybe because Perrin is curious. She's very curious, Perrin. She tries to hide it behind the clinical manner, but it doesn't quite work. I've been thinking about what Sale said about running, the people who have run from her. I asked her about it, sort of indirectly, and she talked around it in a way that suggested she's not used to talking directly about things that affect her. Which is, I recognize that. It's a thing people do when they've had to be very careful for a very long time. I asked her what she did for work, which I realize, given everything, was a spectacularly naive question. She looked at me for a second and then said very carefully that she managed things. I said, "What kind of things?" She said, "Many things, many people, many systems." I said that sounded exhausting. She said, "Yes, it is." And then she laughed. Not a polite laugh, not a social laugh. A real one, genuine, surprised out of her. And I think that might be the part I keep coming back to. Not the situation, not the mystery of it, not any of the things that other people are going to find significant. Just that laugh. Just the surprise of it. She looked younger when she laughed. "I'm going to go back in the morning. There's a coupling assembly on Bay 7 that needs the housing replaced, and after that I'm free until mid-shift." Ordinary Wednesday, almost. The Ironville arrived in our docking corridor at 1800 hours on day 6. They requested an outer approach hold, which means they parked at a distance and waited, rather than docking. I interpreted that as either extreme caution or a desire to observe the station from outside, before committing to a closer position. It turned out to be both. I received a second communication from Commander Sothrek at 18:15. She informed me that the Ironville would maintain its position for 24 hours before approaching for docking, and that during this time, no vessel was to leave Dusk 9 without explicit clearance from the Ironville's command. I was also instructed to ensure that the patient in our medical ward was made aware of the Ironville's presence. I asked how I was to do that without revealing what I knew about who the patient was. Sothrek said, "She already knows who's in that ship, Administrator. She has known since they were 3 days out. Tell her the Ironville has arrived. She will know what it means." I walked to the medical ward personally. Perrin let me in. The patient, Sale, which is how my staff had taken to referring to her, was sitting in the chair by the ward's small observation window, looking at the corridor beyond. Not at anything specific, just looking. I told her the Ironville had arrived. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look anything for a moment. Then she said, 24 hours. I said yes. That was the hold period Commander Sothrek had indicated. She nodded once. Then she looked at me with those eyes that I'd been told about and hadn't quite believed until that moment, and she said, "The engineer, Akafer, is he working today?" I said yes. She said, "Please ask him to come this evening, if he's willing." I said I would. Then I went back to my office and sat very still for a while. Deo told me about it that afternoon, in the break room between shifts. He sat down across from me with his lunch, which he mostly didn't eat, and told me the administrator had come to find him on the floor and that the woman in the medical ward was asking for him. I asked what he thought was going on. He said he didn't know. He said he'd been visiting her every day and they talked and he liked her. He paused here, trying to find the word, she was real, he said. Like a real person in a way that some people aren't, that some people perform realness without having it. I asked if he thought she was dangerous. He looked at me like I'd said something a bit foolish, not unkindly. Just like the question hadn't occurred to him, and he was genuinely considering it for the first time. He said, "She fell on the deck of Bay 14 and I held her head off the floor. It's hard to be scared of someone after that." I didn't have a response to that. I told him to be careful anyway. He said, "Always." He went that evening. I know because I saw him leave, still in his work boots, carrying nothing, walking at that particular pace he has when he's going toward something he's not entirely sure of but is going toward anyway. Not quite quick, not quite hesitant, just going. I went back to the coolant flush in Bay 11. I worried about him the whole rest of the shift. She was standing when I came in that evening. Standing and looking out the observation window at the docking corridor, and specifically, I understood when I saw her focus, at the distant lights of the Ironville holding position in the outer approach zone. I'd heard about the ship. Everyone on the station had. A Class 12 compact enforcement cruiser sitting at outer hold is not the kind of thing that goes unnoticed. People had been talking about it in the bays all afternoon. The theories ranged from a cargo inspection sweep to some kind of security exercise to the possibility that someone important had died somewhere, and the station was being sequestered as a witness hold. Station rumors work fast, and they work with whatever material is available. I stood beside her at the window for a moment without saying anything. She was watching the ship. Then she said, "They came for me." Not like it was a surprise, like it was a fact the way gravity is a fact, just there, immovable. I asked if that was a good thing. She said, "It is complicated." I waited. She said, "There are people who do not wish me to return to where I belong. They arranged what happened on the Harrow Wind. They will not stop because I have survived." I asked if the Ironville could protect her. She said, "Yes, but there is a cost to being protected. There is always a cost." I thought about that. Then I said something that I've thought about a lot since, in terms of whether it was presumptuous of me. I said that it seemed to me that she had been handling things on her own for a long time, and maybe accepting help didn't have to mean losing what she'd been protecting. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "You are very calm about all of this." I said I was trying to be. I said I didn't fully understand what was happening, but I understood the shape of it. Someone had tried to hurt her. She'd survived. Now there were people trying to make sure it didn't happen again. The details were unfamiliar, but the shape was something I recognized. She said, "And if I told you the details were considerably larger than you imagine?" I said that was probably true, but I didn't think it changed the shape. She looked at me for a long time. The Ironville's lights were steady in the window behind her. She said, "I want to tell you something, Deo Akafer, and I want you to understand that I do not tell people things. I have not, for a very long time, told people things. It is not in the nature of my position to tell people things." I said, "Okay." She said, "I was afraid. On the floor of that bay. I was afraid in a way I had not allowed myself to be afraid for years. And you sat beside me and talked to me as though I was simply a person who needed someone to be beside them." I said, "You were." She said, "Yes." And then she said, "That is rarer than you know." At 900 on day 7, the Ironville broke its outer approach hold and began its docking approach to way station Dusk 9. The docking request was routed through Commander Sothrek's direct channel to the station administrator's console rather than the standard automated queue. The bay assigned was Bay 1, the largest and most formally appointed docking facility on the station, typically reserved for high-designation compact vessels and official diplomatic transports. Bay 1 had not been used in 14 months. The maintenance crew was given 3 hours to prepare it. Deo Akafer was on that crew. By multiple accounts, he worked steadily and without comment throughout the preparation, doing the same job he always did, which was to check everything twice and fix what needed fixing before anyone could notice it was broken. At 13:15, the Ironville docked. The ship was significantly larger than anything the station had hosted in recent memory. It filled Bay 1 to a degree that caused several technical staff to pause and re-verify the clearance measurements before the final approach, because experience told them there wasn't enough room, and the numbers said there was, and both those things turned out to be true, barely. The crew that disembarked was not large, 12 personnel, all in compact enforcement dress uniform, weapons present but holstered. Formation type. At their head, Commander Sothrek, a Veloran female of middle age by her species reckoning, which meant she looked approximately 60 in human terms and was probably twice that in absolute years. She moved like she'd been making entrances her entire career and had become very good at them. Behind her, 6 personnel carrying equipment that required 2 of the station's cargo lifts to accommodate. Behind them, 4 more. And behind those 4, 2 individuals who were not in uniform and were not carrying anything. They were wearing the same kind of dark suit material that the patient had arrived in, fully powered and active. They walked in a specific and deliberate pattern relative to each other, maintaining a fixed distance between themselves and a central space between them that appeared empty but was, based on the way the formation moved around it, clearly not. There was something in that space, something that the standard bay lighting didn't seem to fully illuminate, something that moved with the formation but didn't move exactly like the personnel around it. Several of the technical staff watching from the secondary positions in Bay 1 later described this portion of the Ironville's arrival in very different ways, which is typical of witnesses encountering perceptual phenomena they don't have a framework for. Some said there was a shimmer, some said a blur. One said it was like looking at something through water. One, who I believe was trying to be more technically accurate than poetic, said it appeared to be a localized disruption of light wave propagation, approximately the size and general shape of a person, moving through the bay with clear intentionality. Whatever the case, the formation moved from the Ironville's hatch to the bay's main access corridor without stopping, without addressing anyone, without acknowledgement of the station personnel present. Commander Sothrek paused at the door to the corridor. She turned to Administrator Tolan, who had come down to the bay floor personally for the arrival. She said, "Is the patient ambulatory?" Tolan said she was. Sothrek said, "Good, we'll need a private meeting space. Something with a window, if possible." Tolan said the station's observation lounge on level 4 would work. Sothrek looked at him for a moment, then she said, "The engineer, Akafor, he should come too." Tolan said he wasn't sure that was appropriate. Sothrek said, "It is specifically appropriate, she'll want him there." Then she walked through the door. Tolan found Deo Akafor on the far side of Bay 1, recalibrating a docking arm sensor that had been reading slightly off during the arrival procedure, because that was what Deo Akafor did during arrivals. He fixed what needed fixing. I was in the middle of recalibrating the sensor housing when the administrator found me. He looked like a man who had been told something significant and hadn't fully processed it yet, which I recognized because I had felt that way myself more than once in the previous week. He told me I was needed in the observation lounge on level 4. I asked why. He looked at me with the expression of someone who doesn't know exactly how to say the thing they need to say, and he settled on, "The people from the Ironville have asked for you." I put down my calibration tool. I thought about asking more questions. Then I thought that more questions probably wouldn't help me understand anything, and the only way to understand was to go. I went. The observation lounge on level 4 is the nicest room on the station, which on Dusk 9 means it has clean windows and furniture that isn't bolted down, and the overhead lighting doesn't flicker. There's a long view of the outer approach corridor from those windows. You can see a significant stretch of the Vortex corridor on a clear day, which in space means when the navigational beacons are all functioning and not causing visual interference. When I arrived, Sail was already there. She was standing by the windows in the same utility clothes she'd been wearing all week, which she'd apparently declined to change for this occasion, and she was looking out at the corridor. Commander Sothrek was seated at the main table. Several of the Ironville's personnel were positioned around the room. There were also 2 individuals I didn't recognize, not in compact uniforms, wearing formal attire in a style I couldn't place to any specific culture. They were very still. They were looking at Sail. Sail turned when I came in. She looked at me for a moment, then she looked at the administrator who was behind me, and she said in the translator version, "Thank you. You may go." Tolan left. I stood where I was. Commander Sothrek said in standard compact common language, "Please sit, engineer. This will take some time." I sat. What came next, and I want to be careful about how I describe this, because I've been asked to keep certain specifics out of the public record, and I'm going to do that. What came next was an hour of conversation that I mostly listened to, because most of it was not about me, and most of it involved information and context that I was encountering for the first time. I'll say what I can. There was a governance structure, a real one, old and complicated and larger than anything I'd previously understood to exist, that Sail was central to. Not peripheral to, not adjacent to. Central. The word used multiple times by Sothrek and by the 2 formally dressed individuals who turned out to be some kind of senior advisors was continuance. As in, the continuance of this structure. As in, without her, the continuance was uncertain. As in, the people who had attacked the Harrow Wind had understood this perfectly. There was also, and this was the part where my ability to process things calmly started to work a little harder than usual, something said about how she had come to be on the Harrow Wind alone, without her protection detail, traveling under a cover identity, on a route that was supposed to be unknown. She had chosen to travel that way. She had chosen it specifically. Not for this journey, she had done it before, periodically, across years. She traveled the way she had on the Harrow Wind because, and I am going to use her words as closely as the translator's record allows, I needed to understand what the galaxy is when it does not know who I am. When it treats me as I would be treated without position or power, I needed to know what is real. Sothrek said, in a tone that suggested this was a very old and unsettled argument. This is why we have diplomatic observers. This is why we have. Sale said, observers who know who they are observing, it is not the same. There was a silence. And then one of the formal advisors said, not unkindly, that they understood her reasons. That they had always understood her reasons. That the problem was the risk, and the risk had now manifested, and the Harrow Wind was. Sale said, I know what the Harrow Wind is, I was there. Another silence. Then Sale looked at me. She said, Deo Akafor traveled from Earth to work on a way station at the outer edge of a corridor that most registered ships avoid if they can. He repairs pressure couplings and docking arm sensors. He earns a technical worker's rate. He carries no weapons. He has no authority and no documentation beyond his engineering certification. She paused. She said, and when a stranger fell in front of him, he ran to her. Not after he'd assessed the situation. Not after he'd determined whether it was safe. He ran to her because she fell, and that is what a person does when another person falls. She looked around the room. She said, that is what I went to find. That is what I found. The room was very quiet. Sothrek looked at the table. One of the advisors looked out the window. I didn't know what to do, so I didn't do anything. I just sat there. Then Sale said quietly, still to me, I want to show you something. And the two individuals who had come in with her and who had been standing near the doorway did something. I couldn't see exactly what. I couldn't follow the motion, and the quality of the light in the room changed. Not dramatically, not theatrically, just changed, softened, settled. And Sale stood a little differently. That's the only way I can describe it. She was the same person, same face, same eyes, same utility clothes, but she stood like she had put something down, some sustained effort, some constant accommodation, and the quality of her presence in the room was bigger, not louder, not more imposing, just more fully itself. She said, now you know. I thought about it for a moment. I said, does it change anything about the conversations we've had? She considered me for a long time. She said, that is precisely the question I needed to hear someone ask. There are things I've been told not to write down, and I'm going to respect that. There are things I've been told not to talk about, and I'll respect that too. Not because I'm afraid, just because some things are actually appropriate to keep private, and I can tell the difference. But here's what I can say. She's leaving tomorrow. The Ironville is taking her back to wherever she belongs, and compact security personnel are going to be significantly more attentive going forward, which I gather is a diplomatic way of saying she is not traveling on a Class 7 courier under a false identity ever again. She came to find me this afternoon. Not in the medical ward, she'd been cleared for general access since day 6. She found me in Bay 14, which I don't think was a coincidence. I was doing routine maintenance. The Harrow Wind had been moved out the previous day by an Ironville team, and I don't know where it went, and I haven't asked. She came in while I was working and didn't say anything for a few minutes, just stood near the entrance and watched. Then she said, in common language this time, she'd been using it since day 7. Once whatever reason for concealing it was no longer relevant, she said. I have been trying to determine what to say. I said that was fine, I wasn't going anywhere. She said, that seems to be a characteristic of yours. I said I supposed it was. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "There are forms, there are official processes. Through the Compact's liaison office, it is possible to make arrangements for individuals who have performed services of," she stopped, started again. "For individuals who have helped people in my position, financial arrangements, relocation opportunities, formal recognition through appropriate channels." I said I didn't need any of that. She said, "I know. That is why I'm mentioning it." We looked at each other. I said, "Is there something you actually want to say?" She said, "Yes. I have been thinking about it for 9 days and I am not sure how to say it in a way that doesn't sound," she paused again, "in a way that doesn't make it smaller than it is." I waited. She said, "You did not look at me and see something to run from or something to secure or something to leverage or something to fear. You looked at me and saw someone who needed help. I have been many things for a very long time. I have almost forgotten what it is to be only that, only someone who needs help." I said that everyone is only that at some point. She said, "Most people who meet me have decided what I am before they see me. You decided nothing. You just looked." I said, "I saw you fall, that's all." She said, "That's everything." We didn't talk much after that. She stayed until I'd finished the maintenance check, which was another 40 minutes, and she watched me work. Not hovering, not studying. Just present, like someone who had been in motion for a very long time and was briefly, carefully still. Before she left, she said, "I'll remember this place." I said, "It's a pretty unremarkable way station." She said, "No, it isn't." And she went. Section XIX, Final Medical Notes. Patient Sale, designation classified, was formally discharged from Dusk 9 medical care at 600 on day 10. All wounds had healed to an extent that exceeded any clinical expectation established at time of admission. The patient's physiology had demonstrated a regenerative capability that I have submitted for documentation to the Compact Medical Research Archive, with all identifying information removed at the patient's request. The patient departed with the Ironville at 7:30. Prior to departure, she visited my office briefly. We had spoken a number of times during her stay, and she had been candid in a way that I suspect she was not always given the opportunity to be. She thanked me, not formally, specifically. She said she understood that I had gone significantly beyond standard medical protocols to care for her without knowing who she was, and that it had mattered. I told her I go beyond standard protocols for everyone. That's what medicine is for. She said, "Yes. I know that now, better than before." She also asked me before she left to keep Deo Akafer's name out of any official records associated with the incident if at all possible, not because she was trying to erase what he'd done, but because she said, "He is the kind of person who should be allowed to be ordinary for as long as he chooses. That is not a given. I would like to protect it if I can." I said I would do what I could. She said, "Thank you, doctor." Then she left. I stood in my office for a while. Then I went to check on my other patients, because there were other patients, and medicine does not pause for extraordinary things. Section XX, Epilogue Testimony. So that's what I know, most of it. The parts I actually witnessed, the parts Deo told me, the parts that became common knowledge on the station in the days after the Ironville left. The Ironville left. The woman they called Sale left with it. The Harrow Wind was gone. Security kept a heightened presence for another 2 weeks and then gradually normalized. Administrator Tolan was called to Vethia Prime for a meeting that lasted 4 days, and he came back quieter than he'd left, but still functional. Deo went back to work. I asked him, the day after the Ironville departed, if he was okay. He said yes. Then he said, "It's strange, knowing something happened but not being able to talk about it." I said, "Do you want to talk about it?" He said, "Not particularly. I think I've got the important parts sorted." I asked what the important parts were. He thought about it for a moment the way he thinks, not hurried, not performing consideration, just actually doing it, and he said, "She needed someone to stay, so I stayed. The rest of it, the other stuff, who she actually is, all the big complicated things, that's real, but it's hers, not mine. My part was pretty small." I said, "Deo, I don't think your part was small." He said, "I'm going to let you believe that, but from where I was standing it really was just ordinary." And he picked up his toolkit and went back to Bay 14, because there was a fuel umbilical connection that had been reading slightly above the optimal pressure threshold for the past 3 days, and he wanted to check the housing seal before it became an actual problem. That's the thing about Deo. He finds the thing that needs doing and he does it. He's been doing that his whole life. He did it on the floor of Bay 14, no different from any other morning, and the fact that who he did it for turned out to be, well, you know who she turned out to be. He didn't at the time. And I genuinely believe that even if he had known, he would have done the same thing, probably with the same calm, probably while talking in that quiet, even voice. I asked him once, later, much later, if it felt different now, knowing what he knew. He said, "The moment on the floor. No, that part doesn't change. She was hurt and I went to her, that's a fixed thing." I asked if he ever thought about the rest of it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Sometimes I think about the fact that somewhere out there, something that matters a very great deal is still going because she survived. And she survived because she got to the bay when she did, and I was already there." He paused. "And I was already there because I came in early to check the umbilical connections." He looked at me. He said, "So I suppose you could say it all depended on a pressure coupling in Bay 9. I asked what he meant. He said, "The one I fixed the day before. That's why I was thinking about pre-arrival checks. That's why I came in early." He picked up his coffee. He said, "Things hold together because someone does the small work. That's always been true, always will be." And then he drank his coffee, and the station turned through another shift, and somewhere in the vortex corridor, the Ironville carried its passenger back toward the responsibilities she carried. And none of us on Dusk 9 talked about it much, because Deo didn't want us to, and because we understood that some things are better preserved in their simplest form. A person fell. Someone stayed. That was all. That was everything.